our actions are interactions. Oxford University in England is a very old college with very old buildings. One building in particular was very, very special. It was a very old building. It was 150 years old, and its roof was made of full, long beams of oak, beautiful oak tree trunks. Now, 150 years later, those beams were beginning to rot and fall apart. So the faculty came together to consult about a solution. They inquired about the cost of these beams, and they found out that even one beam would cost over £100,000. Now, that's university. They don't have that kind of budget. One of the younger members on the faculty said, before you take any drastic measures, let me do some research. 2 weeks later, she comes back and she says, I'm very glad we took the time to do the research, because we have found out that the architect who built this very building 150 years ago planted a group of oak trees specifically for that purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, this is sustainable design. Designing sustainably is not new. It's a very, very old concept. And it's really just about facilitating processes even 150 years into the future. When we talk about facilitating processes into the future, I want to highlight 3 concepts we work with, 3 dynamics. The first one is the intelligence of users. Then come the honesty of behavior, and the third one is the quality of time. Now, how do we harness the intelligence of users? How do we do that? In the 1970s, in the world of business, Robert Greenleaf spoke about the concept of servant leadership. He said that good leaders must first become good servants. Now, what Greenleaf is talking about here is this concept of mature leadership, a leadership that is not a dictatorship, but a service. Let me illustrate. Imagine I'm standing here at point A with a group of bricks. Now, I need to get these bricks to point B there without leaving my spot. I may just think of throwing the bricks. Very good, job done. Now, I'm still at point A, but this time, instead of a group of bricks, I have a collection of birds. I need to get these birds to point B there without leaving my spot. If I throw them, that's not going to work. They're going to fly in all their own directions. But I may think of throwing food, and the birds will follow. This is an example of leadership by pull, not push. A leadership that's not a dictating, but a facilitating method. Now, what is facilitation? I'm sure you've heard that term a number of times. Let's flesh out the notion of facilitation for a little bit. I always do that by sharing one of my favorite stories. This story is about an architect who was asked to design a university campus on a site that, if you look at it from above, it looks a little bit like that. So she designs the different departments, and she built them on site. But contrary to the expectation of the staff and students, she doesn't design any routes, any pathways to walk. Instead, she plants the whole site with grass. Now, after the first semester, paths appear in the grass on their own. She then comes back, and she then paves these pathways just as they emerged. And she noticed 2 things. The first is these pathways appeared in places she wouldn't have predicted, and none of them were straight. Now, this is a story that's a very good illustration of 3 qualities of facilitation. In a way, there are 3 provocative design guidelines. The first quality of facilitating is creating things that are incomplete. The architect didn't finish the design. She didn't say, this is where the path should be, it's now finished, completed, and then I go. Instead, she left the design incomplete. And that was the very invitation for the staff and students to give their input. She also planted the site with grass, not asphalt. And that's the second quality of facilitation, which is creating things impermanent. Grass took on the input of time. It was a recorder of input. And that was very, very important for this notion of facilitation. The third quality of facilitation is designing things that are imperfect. Remember, the paths were in unusual locations, and none of them were straight. That means we're talking here about the aesthetic quality, a human aesthetic. This is where we celebrate textures and smells and imperfections and the humanity of even inanimate things. So we could say that facilitating is really just creating contexts that are incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect. Now, brings us back to gathering the intelligence of users. One way to gather the intelligence of users is then to foster the interactions of these users, to facilitate these interactions. Now, when we talk about the honesty of behavior, it is very important to be able to harness that honesty from behavior. I'll give you another example. I myself am an architect, and I'm trained to deal with form. I'm not interested in form. I'm much more interested in flow, in how things move, how people move around the space, how they use it, how they interact with it, what parts of it they use, what they don't use. If you look at this example, it's not what is built, but actually what is not built that people are using. The value is in what is not there. It's not about the context, but about the behavior that the context encourages. And this is not to say that the context is not important. On the contrary, the context is as important as the quality of the relationships and the quality of the interactions it fosters. Remember it that way. It's not what something does. It's not what something is. It is indeed what it does. It's not what it is in itself, it's the interactions it fosters from there. So to gather and harness the honesty of behavior, we need to move away from conversation and much more into observation of flows. That brings us to utilizing the quality of time. How do we utilize the quality of time? If you remember the Oxford story I just opened with, you realize very quickly that sustainability is about time. It's about what we call the fourth dimension, the time dimension. Now, sustainability has, at least I believe, three qualities. The first one is the physical quality. This is where most of the global discourse on sustainability is nowadays. We talk about the physical quality of the materials and the systems that we use here and now. Sustainability has a second quality, and that's a quality of resilience. This is where we're talking about creating sustainable systems, systems that can adapt, that are assimilative of the changes imposed on them. This is a responsive quality of sustainability. The last quality of sustainability, which is even more mature than that, is a quality of anticipatory. Sustainability needs to be anticipating of the changes in the long-term future. This is not a responsive quality, but actually a proactive quality. And this is where, when we want to design something that is sustainable, we need to build into the system the ability to adapt itself by itself. So when we talk about sustainability, it's really about fostering interactions along the time dimension and really thinking 150 years into the future, what is going to happen and how do we empower the system to be able to deal with those changes. Now, if you look at those dynamics, I talk a lot about interactions. Here is the one thing to take home with you today, besides the bar of chocolates that you have on your seats. Do not design interactions. If you design interactions, it falls back into the leadership model of a dictator. Instead, we need to facilitate interactions. And the only way to do that is to design the context for interactions. Do not design interactions, instead design the context for interactions. The question is how? How do we create context that foster interactions? Now, this question is not an easy one, and this is the question that drives my work, myself, but also my team. A few years ago, I founded AKKA. AKKA is an architecture and urban design studio based in Amsterdam. And the main question we work with is exactly that. How do we create context that foster interactions? Our work at AKKA is driven by a very simple vision, a very simple philosophy we call architecting interaction. And if you see, the emphasis here is not on the architecture, but actually on the interactions. Now, interactions are important because we believe that they're the seeds of innovation. This is where everything starts. And when interactions are the seeds of innovation, this is where you can look at different contexts, different situations, and say, which ones need to foster interactions? We've looked at that, and I can tell you every space, but also every context, every situation, every product, every service you're busy with needs to foster interactions. The only difference is there are different interactions and to varying degrees. Creating context that foster interactions is the essence of the vision of architecting interaction. Now, that's a vision, that's a philosophy. Now we need to make it reality. We need to be able to implement it, and this is where we start looking at the process. Now, the process of architecture, widely known and used, actually doesn't work, at least not for us. When we aim to foster interactions, the deliverable goes beyond the physical. I'll explain what I mean. Who remembers this formula? We're in a high school. I hope a few more people remember this formula. Great. Now, very simply put, this is E equal mc squared, where E is the energy, m the mass, and c the speed of light. Now, I took the very artistic freedom to translate that into architecture. And what happens is you realize that mass becomes the built mass, the bricks and mortar. This is where we're talking about floors, walls, and ceilings, the actual form. The speed of light is the velocity, the movement of people in the space. This is their interactions. And what comes from that is this emerging quality of a space when the focus is beyond the physical mass. There is a fundamental difference between focusing on delivering the space as a fixed static mass or focusing on what that space can deliver, the energy that can come through that. And this is valid for any product or service or activity you are busy with, physical or digital. There is a fundamental difference between focusing on M, on your product or service as a static entity, or focusing on what that product or service can deliver beyond itself. And this is where we want to be. We want to be able to move from quantitative to qualitative approaches. What I said about the architectural process is we've tried it, and it actually doesn't deliver the results we're looking for. To be able to deliver the E, this energy and emerging quality, we had to go beyond designing spaces as a static, fixed mass. So what we did is we had to invent and come up with our own custom, unique process. What's essential to know about this process is that it's an intrinsically collaborative process, and it's based on the communal creation of knowledge. I'll explain. The process is 4 phases. 3 of these phases happen before people can move into the space and start using it. Now, I'm going to say space. You think product, service, program, whatever you're busy with, it will still work. What I will do here is explain very briefly the principle of these phases. What you notice is that the last phase can only happen after people start using that space created. The first phase is what we call appreciate. And this phase is about rounding the different people, the different groups of people concerned by this project, and extracting from them their insight, and creating from there an aligned understanding. From that understanding, we go into phase 2, which we call the kernel, and this phase is about creating a certain vision, a shared vision based on that understanding that we created in the first phase. Now, this vision is now ready to be implemented. This is where we go into the third phase, which is called the kickstart. And this is where we use the methodology of learning by doing to be able to turn that vision into reality. This is where development, construction, demolition, implementation, all of this happens. Traditionally, at the end of this phase is where the building is so-called finished, completed, people move in, and the architects are never to be seen again, like good criminals that never go back to the scene of the crime. Of course, what I'm showing here is that we have a 4th phase, a last phase, and that's the one I want to emphasize the most. This phase is called adapt. And in this phase, it's only based on observing how people are using the different features of the space, how they're moving around it, what flows they're describing in it, that we can bring the last refinements and fine-tuning to what we've created. This is how we create a sustainable space in the sense of it can sustain itself over the long future. And this is where we can create a living space. Now, the backbone of this process is what we call community consultation. And this is where we need to extract the insights, not the opinion, but the insights of the different groups of people concerned by the project. And this is because we simply believe that the users are the experts in how they use a space. We engage people in this process not to find out what they want the space to be, but to uncover collectively what the space needs to be. And if you translate that to your own activities and your own processes and your own products and services, you will see what difference it will make. We've applied this vision and this process to an array of projects. I will only show you a few highlights of them here tonight. And this is to describe the different scales and locations and structures they were created in. This is the National Library in Qatar, the Qatar Foundation headquarters. This is a co-working space in Amsterdam. You have a university and school in Dubai, a very different school in Mongolia, much smaller. We've also worked on local schools in Holland. Then we have also applied this to, this is, for example, a toy museum in Amsterdam. This is a very urban project that's a collaboration with Shell in Mozambique, and then another collaboration with the Ministry of Infrastructure in Holland. And this is simply to show that this vision and this process are applicable to any service or product you're busy with. And for us, it doesn't only mean building a new space or building from scratch. It's also very applicable to inhabiting an existing space. This is where we talk of renovation and reuse of existing spaces, especially in Europe. But the third possibility of this, which is one of the most unique aspects of this approach, is really when we're talking about optimizing the same space, the current space. People only go to architects when they need to inhabit an existing space or move to a new space or build it from scratch. But that's not always what is needed, and no architect would tell you that, of course. But the point is, sometimes the best solution you can do is optimize the current space you are already in. And this is where you're looking at the last phase of the process. In any case, before you figure out what is the best situation to do for every project, it is very crucial to go through the first phase of appreciation and create this alignment, not only to find the right answers, but indeed to ask the right questions. Now, when you look at this process, the phase of adapting, which is our last phase, actually creates a renewed understanding, a renewed appreciation, which means, of course, that the process is not a linear process, but a circular process. There are three qualities that are important to know about this process. The first one is the process is designed as an open process. Without the collaboration of the different users and other experts, the process cannot move forward. The process in itself is incomplete. The process is changing because it takes all the different inputs and all the different insights that are coming to it and all the different moments in time, which mean at any given moment in time, this process is impermanent. And the process feeds on insights. And insights come from the different groups of people concerned by the project, which means the process actually remains imperfect. Remember, you don't design interactions, you design the context for interactions. And that might sound like a slight, but actually a very important shift. In conclusion, architecting interaction is really larger than architecture and urban design. I use them for architecture and urban design. Those are our fields. I invite you to use them for whatever field and activity you are engaging in. Because remember, every context needs to foster interactions. We're only talking about different interactions and interactions to varying degrees. How we do that? We do that by gathering the intelligence of users, harnessing the honesty of behavior, and utilizing the quality of time. And this is done with a very important concept in mind, the concept of do not fall back into designing interactions. Instead, facilitate interactions, and we do that by creating the context and making those contexts fruitful enough for interaction to emerge in. How do we do that? We do that in an array of different approaches. In the world of architecture, we talk about new build spaces, but we talk about inhabiting in existing spaces, optimizing current spaces, or simply aligning and appreciating the situation before we do anything else. In any case, when we do that, the question remains, how can we create contexts that foster interactions? And the answer is very, very simple. We do that by creating incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect context through a process that is in itself incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect. And that's because, after all our actions are interactions. Thank you very much.